Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. You're listening to our Dungeons and Dragons game. And as always, I am your host, the Dungeon Master, or DM for short. And today I'm going to do things a little bit differently than I normally do. Normally we play some D&D and then afterwards I make a video where I share what we did. This is how the story went. I'm not actually going to do that today. Today, instead of that, I'm going to just be talking about an old game called Metamorphosis Alpha. It is relevant to my game and what I'm doing, and I'll explain that here in a minute. But I guess before I do anything else, I'm going to read the introduction to the game because that is going to tell you a lot of information. So it starts off and it says, mankind's urge to explore and expand its frontiers finally caused another push into the vastness of space, first interplanetary, then interstellar. By the 23rd century, a great migration wave was spreading from old Terra to the hundreds of inhabitable worlds which had been discovered in the Milky Way galaxy. During the next 100 years, colonization ships of all types and descriptions went out to the stars, bearing seedling colonies seeking a better life. Many found their new homes, for better or worse, but for one reason or another, scores of these starships never reached their destination. This game is based on just such an event. The fate of a colony ship which became lost. The Starship Warden was created from the designs used in the United Western Starship Cartel program, and it was laid down in the Trans-Plutonian Space Yards in 2277. The design was the most ambitious ever attempted. The blueprints calling for an oval spheroid of tremendous size using a new metal alloy of tensile strength previously unknown. The ship was an incredible 50 miles long, 25 miles wide, and 8.5 miles tall. Additional levels above and below the central one brought the total number of decks to 17. The Warden required 11 years to complete, and it did not leave the Sol system until 2290 because of the effort required to outfit the ship. The vessel contained complete Terran environments, and the colonists were not rigidly screened for the expedition, for it was held that the Warden's accommodations would place few physical or psychological stresses upon colonists or crewmen. So it goes on and it lists, let's see here. Um, the vessel was basically given over to large open areas with a simple system of electronic locks used to ensure that colonists did not stray into command or possibly harmful areas. With its cargo of the flora and fauna of Earth, 1.5 million colonists and 50,000 crew members, the wonder of the interstellar colonization age, set forth to found a new world many light years from its old home. That's basically where the intro ends. Um, so the reason I wanted to read it is it the ship is huge. I can't begin to really do it justice. We've tried to map it. My son works with CGI stuff, and he's trying to generate the ship now on his computer to give us an idea of these huge rooms. There's there's a dome on the top of the ship that is half a mile tall, and so that brings the ship's height to 9 miles. I feel like it's weird they leave the dome out of that description. But at any rate, so if you divide 9 miles by 17 decks, right? And some of those decks are the ceiling is much lower, right? And then in other decks, the ceiling is massive. Um, it can be hard to imagine what it would be like to live in the ship. Um, one level of the ship is nothing but city. And what I mean by that is I don't mean they have crew quarters in the traditional sense of like, say, a ship on Star Trek or something like that. I mean, they just built a city in this thing. So it would be like apartment buildings and stuff like that. If I wanted to compare it to anything, I'm actually kind of thinking of an old anime called Macross, which in America we called it Robotech. But in that, in the main ship on the show, they had a city in there. Um, so I think that's interesting. And then I think it's the level right below it, but one of the other levels of the ship, at any rate, that is all farmland. And so they have actual tractors that are like plowing fields to uh to make the crops that these colonists needed for food on their way to where they were going, right? So that's always the level I think of when I think of this game actually. Is the ship is so big that the farming level has rolling hills and it has fields and all this stuff, and the sky in here is artificial. So I would think of something like, say, The Truman Show. If you've ever seen that, it's an old movie with Jim Carrey where his entire life takes place in this fake town. And there's a scene where it seems like he's outside on a sunny day, but there's this scene where um a huge, like a stage light, crashes nearby, and he goes over and looks at it and is confused, like, where the heck did this come from? But when he looks up, he thinks he's seeing the sky. He doesn't know it's fake. So that's the same thing on this ship. Um, and thanks to, various bits of technology, they can simulate a sun, and the sun um, does such a good job that, for instance, crops grow, things like that. The humans were getting the vitamin D and stuff they needed in their skin. Um, so that's sort of at a glance, that's the setting of the game. So on the way to where they're going, though, they encounter this area of space that is full of radiation. And this is where things go wrong. This is kind of their Titanic moment in a way. So the radiation affects the ship's computers so that they're not working the way they should. And assumedly, they had force fields and stuff to protect them from radiation. So then those go down, and so on and so forth. And at any rate, so the radiation automatically kills a percentage of the crew. And then those who don't die from that, the radiation starts to mutate what they've brought along on this journey. And so if you think of the ship almost like a gigantic Noah's Ark in a way, right? It's got a bunch of animals on here because wherever they're going, like for an easy example, they have like livestock. So sheep, pigs, cattle, stuff like that, right? Chickens. they've got that on the ship. So the radiation mutates. I'll use pigs as my example. It mutates the pigs. And so then what you end up with is these anthropomorphic kind of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles style mutation where the animal now can walk upright, it can use a weapon, it can speak, things like that. And I grew up on a farm, and pigs tend to be really ill-tempered. So likewise, these porkers, that are the mutant pigmen, they're really mean. Um, so you got stuff like that starts killing crewmen. And there was something on the ship called russet mold spores. And those mutate. And this kind of varies depending on which edition of the game you're talking about, but the the version that I use is from 2011. And so the deal then is that this mold mutates, somebody breathes some of it in and they get it in their lungs, but they become like a zombie. And after they are fully zombified, the mold is on the outside of their body then too. And so they got like mushrooms and stuff growing out of the side of their head, things like that. And so they do what zombies do. They attack another member of the crew and assimilate them. And so now that person is also what they call a vegapygmy. Um, and so you've got a zombie outbreak happening on the ship. I don't know if I mentioned it, but the mutant animals, they're attacking the crew. So pretty soon you basically don't have any crew left, basically being the operative term. So there's multiple ways you can play the game. One of them is you are one of the humans. You wake up like in a pod where you've been in suspended animation this whole time, and by some fluke the pod protected you from all of this stuff thus far. And so your character is very familiar with the ship. They had been around the ship before they went into cryo sleep or whatever, and they they get out and they see all the damage that's been done to their ship, and then their job is to basically purge the ship of all these dangerous life forms, right? Mutants and zombies and what have you. Um, and then another version that a lot of people I know who've played this is what they've done, is the idea that there's cloning machinery on the ship and it's not working because of the radiation damage. So you are not the original guy who went on this voyage. You are a clone of him, but you do not have his memories. And so when you wake up, you are not only um, having to survive, you are also learning about Earth. That as you go around, because there's an element, for instance, there's a city level. Can't remember now if I mentioned that or not. Like there's the farm level, which I feel like is sort of self-explanatory. There's also just one level is nothing but a city, right? So when you go in there, parts of the city have been wrecked by this zombie outbreak and other rampaging, mutants and stuff like that. So it's urban exploration. So that would be like going into a place that's dark, there's no power here. When you're walking around, your boots are crunching on broken glass and things like that, right? And you are finding relics of this bygone world. And so your character is learning about Earth as this happens. And then sometimes the trail of breadcrumbs leads you to whoever it was you were a clone of, and then you start finding out about that person, and then you're learning about yourself. I know a lot of people that play it that way. Um, the third way you can play the game, well, I mean, you could play a mutant. I actually don't know anyone who's ever done it. I'm sure people have. If you have, by all means, say something in the comments section about that. I'd be curious how that went. But there's another way you can play the game, and that is that you are a Dungeons and Dragons character who comes to the ship. And so that's what I'm going to talk about next is the crossover thing and why this is secretly a Dungeons and Dragons story. So in the 1970s and 1980s, D&D was made by a company called TSR. TSR felt like they had cornered the market on the fantasy genre, and they knew a lot of people just weren't that into fantasy. I actually fall into that camp myself. I don't know why. It doesn't grab me as much personally. Um, so they wanted to go after the science fiction fans. Um, and looking at their demographic, Star Trek, this was written in 1976, by the way. So this is pre-Star Wars. Star Trek is in reruns and is really gaining popularity among sort of what they see as their target demographic. So at any rate, they wanted to cash in on that. So they made this. But then the D&D guys, my understanding, because I was born in 76, so I mean I wasn't there to know. But the D&D crowd didn't seem very interested in trying out Metamorphosis Alpha. And the percentage of gamers as far as fantasy and sci-fi, we kind of know now the bulk of people that play role-playing games prefer the fantasy genre. So TSR really felt like they had to do something, that their sales weren't where they wanted them to be. So they put together a module called the Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, which I just got done running for my group of players. And the earliest version of the story is that in the Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, the idea is that the starship from Metamorphosis Alpha, the warden, had a quote unquote escape pod, which, without me going on a big tangent about it, is basically a huge flying saucer. The warden is miles long. So this quote unquote escape pod is maybe more similar in size to something like a stadium. So it's like on the top of the ship, and it comes off and it goes to this planet called Orth, which is where the Greyhawk setting from D&D takes place. And the ship crashes in some mountains called the Barrier Peaks. And somehow it was never clear to me exactly how. Um, somehow the ship ends up completely covered in stone. I had personally assumed that something in the Barrier Peaks was volcanic and there had been lava that was agitated by the ship's crash, and then the lava cooled down, and that would be why it was completely covered in stone, but the module's not specific about it. At any rate, but so this early idea then is that, like I mentioned, the mutant pigs, they somehow are on the escape pod when the crew is trying to abandon the ship because of all the danger on the ship. And so then the idea is when it crashes, some of those mutant pigmen leave the ship and wander off into the wilderness and reproduce. And they had turned green because of radiation, just like the Incredible Hulk. And they strongly hint that these are basically the first orcs. And if there's other mutant animals on the ship, like a mutant caterpillar or centipede or whatever, that maybe that is where carrion crawlers come from in D&D, and that the humans on the ship, the survivors, they would have then been some of um the forerunners of humanity on Earth. And there was a lot of people listening to this will not like it because they'll say that's not like the D&D continuity, that's not the origin story of the world, so on and so forth. A couple of other examples come to mind. One is in Spelljammer, they had a monster called a Radiant Golem. And interestingly enough, when they say this thing radiates death magic, but they put it in quotations. And when they describe what death magic does to you, they go out of their way to describe radiation poisoning. So they say within, this much time of encountering this golem, your hair starts to fall out, blah, 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 blah. So they were really suggesting that this was not magic at all. This was the old Arthur C. Clarke thing of anything sufficiently technologically advanced would be indistinguishable from magic. Um, so I want to throw that out there. And then the other thing I want to mention is there was this thing that TSR put out called the Wrath of the Immortals boxed set. And it talks about gods in the Dungeons and Dragons world and where they come from. And interestingly enough, one of the immortals they list is a guy named Benakander. And they specifically tell you that Benakander was the engineer on a starship, and he was bathed in some sort of energy that, in his case, mutated him, and he became like a cosmic being. Anybody who's familiar with comic books, by the way, personally, I was always reminded of the Silver Surfer. When I read that story, how the Silver Surfer starts off as a fairly normal guy named Norrin Rad. And then he is bathed in energy thanks to another being called Galactus. And he is turned into a cosmic being called the Silver Surfer. So the immortals in D&D can do this too, where they can select another person who is like just a normal human being, and they can turn them into an immortal. Or to word that a little differently, they can bestow godhood upon others at will. And then the book also gets into great detail about how now that you're an immortal, you can create your own worlds. You can populate them with beings that you've created, yada, yada, yada. And so then I think we look at D&D and we see the various creation stories for, if you really delve into the Greyhawk setting, you're going to find out how Greyhawk was supposedly made. Personally, I feel like if you follow the trail of breadcrumbs, what they're suggesting is the D&D world is the way it is because of Metamorphosis Alpha. And D&D actually takes place in the future. And that when the ship crashed here, the people in the ship that left the ship became the forerunners to all these various famous D&D things. I mentioned the cloning machinery earlier. There's this idea too that, like I said, there's farms on the mothership, right, on the Warden. And so the farms are going to have things like farmers and horses. Well, if the radiation screws up the machines that make the clones, then the way some people run the game is it basically makes a centaur because it jumbled up what it was trying to make. And we said before, the clones don't have memories. They don't know what Earth is or anything like that. But so, think of all the other stuff that would be kind of like that, whether it's a satyr or a mermaid or, a minotaur or whatever. There's so many things from mythology that are part man, part animal, that now we've got that explained. So I really liked that. But so one of the ideas is the escape pod crashes in the Barrier Peaks, and then the Barrier Peaks module, I think, was written around 1980 and was intended, like, they were going to conventions and running that, and then when you would complete the module, they there were repair robots that you would encounter, and then there were these colored cards that you had to collect throughout the adventure. And when you had the right colored cards, the robots would work for you instead of attacking you. And if you tell them to repair the ship, and they do, then the idea is the ship returns to the Warden, and now your D&D characters, I mentioned before, there's different ways you can play Metamorphosis Alpha. This is one of them, where now your D&D characters enter the ship and explore it, and now they're learning about this ancient world called Earth, that is secretly kind of the origin of their species. So I've known a lot of people who ran it that way, where they would take their favorite D&D character and play the game with them. I'm trying to think of anything I'm leaving out. Oh, cassette punk. So when this was written in the 70s, this was the future as those guys had imagined it. And so, of course, they weren't trying to make it stylized science fiction at all. They were just trying to make normal science fiction. But you could say the same thing about guys like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells when they were telling their science fiction stories in the late 1800s. They weren't trying to do steampunk, right? It's just that when we look at it now, we know that's not how the future turned out. So the word we apply to it is steampunk. Well, so likewise, these games, like Metamorphosis Alpha, like I said, comes out in 76. Barrier Peaks, I believe, is 1980. The guys who were working on it at the time were just trying to do science fiction. But now if you pick this up and play it, it seems a little off because we've invented all these things in real life, like the internet, just to name one, or the CD player, that it's not in the game. And so the warden is this sort of weird alternate timeline kind of thing where, for whatever reason, it seems like technology never really, like the 90s never happened. It stayed at that 80s level. So when you go into the houses, like on the farm level, there's farmhouses, and that's what I'm trying to represent with this art here today, by the way. Um, when you go into these houses, they look like houses would in the 80s. And they have things in them, and like they mention video game consoles and stuff like that. And I think they even mention they'll use words like joystick. And I know for some people listening to this is hard to imagine, but for me personally, the first time I remember the modern layout of a controller was the NES. I feel like most people know what an NES controller looked like. It was a rectangle, but on the left, you've got that plus shaped pad, the directional pad, right? D pad, I guess it's called. And then on the right, you had like A and B for jump, but that's mid 80s, right? This predates the NES. So when you're playing the game and you find a video game console, it seems more like an Atari 2600, where it's like, well, it's got a joystick with like one button on top of the joystick and things like that. Um, when they describe stuff in the town, it's going to be all like a roller rink, an old video game arcade. It has this like the retro vibe is baked into it. And um because there's hardly anybody around, the game reminds me a lot of, there's a guy on YouTube named Dan Bell, and he does the Dead Mall series. And sometimes he goes into a mall that closed and it's been vandalized and so on and so forth. And so, like I said earlier, the parts of the city, for instance, where the Vegapygmies did their thing, um, it to me, it reminds me of that part of the urban exploration of Dan Bell's series. But then there's other sections, like for instance, in the farm area, the there are robots that are taking care of everything there, keeping it pristine. And like something I didn't mention was on one of the lowest levels of the ship, um, they have cargo bays down there full of lumber. And that sticks out to me too, that like in the modern day, if you think about, if we went to Mars, how would we actually build a house, right? We would probably send a 3D printer to Mars, and it would probably have some kind of plastic um canisters that you know how a 3D printer works, right? It would put out hot plastic and it would make some kind of like weird Martian igloo kind of thing. So again, that's not how these writers were thinking. The way they were thinking was, once we get there, we need to build houses. How do we build houses in 1976? So it was all the supplies you would need to build a 70s style house. So the cargo bays are full of like plywood and 2x4s and nails and stuff like that. And the robots, if wood on a building rots or something, the robots show up and fix it. And like down in the cargo bay, they're going to have an area that's just nothing but, like, say, vinyl siding or roofing shingles or whatever. And the robots go get what they need and they fix what needs fixed. Um, so it's very interesting that then the ship is giving you this world that in real life it no longer exists, you know. To me that's very interesting, and that's a big um it's a big reason I love this game. The Irish have this word, avala, and it's spelled, I believe, Abhaile, but it's pronounced avala, and it means a lot of things. It doesn't just mean one thing. One thing that it means is nostalgia, but another thing that it means is homesick. And my favorite is it means a a painful longing for a previous time in your life that you will never be able to return to. And I heavily relate to that. And so that's when I play the game, that's kind of my driving reason for liking this game so much. Um, they so they made Metamorphosis Alpha, and basically people didn't like it. I mean, not everybody. I mean, it has a cult following, but there's a reason why everybody's heard of D&D, but hardly anyone has ever heard of Metamorphosis Alpha. Um, I think one of the things that hurt the game was the sheer size of the ship. And I've ran the game a bunch of times over the years. Um, Starting in around 2010, I've ran this game about once every other year. We'll play it for about 3 months, and we'll go around and just kill all the dangerous life forms that are on the ship. And unlike a lot of other games, I feel like this game has more of an ending where eventually you've cleared the ship, you've taken care of the problems, you've kind of fixed everything. You've got nothing left to do now. Um, but when I've ran this game all those times with different groups of players and stuff, something I've ran into, like I had this one player named Carl Betts, and he was really hung up on the ceiling. And it really bothered him that he just couldn't imagine in his head, like when my character looks up, what does he see? And I kept telling him, like, it looks like the sky. Like, you think you're seeing the sky. It's fake. You're indoors, but you think you're seeing the sky. And to me, that wasn't that big of a deal. I just understood that any of the fine detail on the ceiling is so far away you can't make it out, and so on and so forth. And the ceiling would be painted blue. You got a fake sun that from where you are on the ground, it just looks like the sky. The module doesn't specifically state it, but I would assume the ceiling would also share certain characteristics with things like a holodeck, where it's an even more convincing illusion of a real sky. But that really bothered him, and so he couldn't become a fan of this game. He was really agitated by the setting, and I can only assume that a bunch of other people felt the same way, because TSR shifted gears and they took the most general concept of Metamorphosis Alpha, and then they made a different game called Gamma World. And in Gamma World, instead of a spaceship that passes through a cloud of radiation in space, it's um, World War III happens. And in the literal fallout of that conflict, all this radiation left over from the war mutates the animals. So again, you've got mutant pigs that become porkers. Um, but now the sky is the sky. and post-apocalyptic, I think, was easier for people to wrap their head around. Um, that they had seen, Mad Max would have been out at the time and popular and so on and so forth. There was a lot of post-apocalyptic stuff in the 80s because of the all the fears. Everybody thought that Russia was going to nuke America in the 80s, and so that's why you had all these post-apocalyptic movies. At any rate, um, that game worked out better for TSR. I guess I could go off on a big tangent about Gamer World. I like Gamer World too. I just don't like it as well because to me, ironically, I don't feel like Gamer World is particularly cassette punk. Like in Metamorphosis Alpha, you've got those robots that are preserving things and they are keeping sections of the ship pristine. And to me, that's kind of the draw there, actually. And then with Gamma World, everything's bombed out, so it kind of doesn't matter what year the house was made, it's gone. You know what I mean? Or if there is a video game console, somebody already decided to wear it as a piece of armor. So it's a very different kind of a thing, and um I prefer the Gamma World thing because I'm a sucker for the cassette punk, um the nostalgia factor. In fact, Gamma World reminds me of something a lot of you may have heard of called Tales from the Loop. And I don't mean the Netflix series or whoever it was that made it. The series was not good. But Tales from the Loop was a role-playing game from just a couple years ago based on the art of a guy named, I want to say Simon Stalenhag. I don't have it in front of me right now, but he is from Europe and I can't remember where he's from. I want to say it's like Switzerland or Sweden or something. One of those kind of Germanic areas that's not Germany. But at any rate, so he made this art and it would for a lot of people that saw it, it would be like kids who are out on a BMX bike and they're wearing like the kind of a winter coat that we would have worn in the 80s when we were kids. It's got like almost like a Stranger Things kind of a vibe to it. But then they would be looking at, they'd have like some kind of a giant robot that would be kind of retro looking in a way. And the robot, let's say it was a 100-foot robot, it would be laying in like a field or something with like weeds growing up between its fingers. And these little kids would be like looking at it or maybe just like sitting on top of this dead robot, like having a conversation. But his art, check it out. If you've never seen it before, by all means, check this guy's art out. Um, it was the basis for the game, and in its tagline was something like um remembering an 80s that never happened, something like that. But he he is tapping into this thing that a lot of people my age share. And if you've never played Metamorphosis Alpha, I do feel like it's guys my age, which I'm pushing 50. I do think we would be the group that would like it the most. Um, but a lot of us don't like how the real world turned out, and we do kind of remember the past through rose-tinted glasses and so on and so forth. And there is this world a lot of us wish we could go back to. There's a lot of people that miss old arcades or that miss the ability to go roller skating on Friday night or whatever. I don't know what things are like where you live, but where I live, everything shut down. When I was a kid, there was this place a few miles south of my house where you could drive boats. They had like this little maze kind of a thing that they dug into the ground and filled it with water. And they had little like one-man boats that were scaled for like a 10-year-old to drive, right? Kind of like, like how a go-kart is like a scaled down version of a car, basically. So it was like that, but it was like little motorboats that were maybe 6 feet long or something like that. And at any rate, you could drive through these like, I don't know what to call them, canals or whatever. But that was just something that when I was a kid, that's something you could do. And they were always open in the summer. And, to go drive the boats costs about as much as it costs to go play putt-putt golf. That's another good example, actually. Where I live, all the putt-putt golf places are gone too. Um, I'm going off on, out in the left field, but the point is that feeling of missing stuff, I feel like they weren't intending to capture that when they made this game, but they accidentally did. And there's something really powerful about that. Um, and I really like this idea. Like for instance, in Gamma World, to use that. And again, Gamma World is almost like the long lost brother of Metamorphosis Alpha. One of the things they said in the 2011 Gamma World was they suggested that you set it in your town. They wanted it to be the post-apocalyptic version of the town that you live in. And I thought that was really interesting. And so likewise, when they were doing the country, the farming level of the ship for Metamorphosis Alpha, and when they did the city level, one of the reasons for that was they wanted because they even say somewhere in the book that they assume 12-year-olds are going to be the bulk of the people who were going to buy this in 1976. And they wanted those kids to feel like for me growing up in a house just like the one pictured in the art here, um they wanted us to feel like that was our house that was on that spaceship. You know what I mean? They wanted that relatability thing. And I thought it was very interesting. But then now when I play the game, right, I'm not a kid thinking, oh, this is my parents' house that I currently live in. Now I'm kind of an old man who's playing the game and I miss the house I was born in and I miss my parents and stuff like that, right? Um, so the game has, it has this sort of warm, fuzzy nostalgia side to it. And then it has this kind of sad wistfulness baked in as well. And I feel like that runs through the game thematically. That on the one hand, you can pick up a really cool laser um and use it on, this monster that's attacking you. And so you get this kind of wish fulfillment thing of adventure and all that. But then on the other hand, there's, this whole crew is gone. And it is almost in a way kind of like a big mausoleum in space. So the game teeters back and forth between those two extremes, but I feel like it does it really well. And the game sort of just gives you what you need to do your thing, and then it stays out of your way. I like that too. A lot of games, ironically, I would say this about D&D. I feel like modern D&D, there's not a lot of guesswork anymore, and that it's here's how it goes. We're kind of giving you a continuity that you have to follow. And in which, mind you, I think good DMs don't follow it and just, do their own thing. But at any rate, with Metamorphosis Alpha, it stays out of your way. It lets you do your thing. Um, at the end of the day, everything is optional. But the bare bone foundation it gives you to build off of is, in my opinion, really cool. So actually, if I had to rank my top 10 RPGs I've ever played, Metamorphosis Alpha would be on that list somewhere. Probably down around 6 or 7, but still, it's on the list. I will say this, the rules and the stats and everything, it is sort of what you would expect from a game made in the 70s. I find them to be a little um awkward. And so for me personally, which is another reason I kept bringing up the 2011 Gamma World system, which was um, it's before fourth edition D&D came out. It's certainly not fifth edition D&D. Um, it's after D&D 3.5, but they had done some stuff with the rules there where it's not quite D&D 3.5. It's almost like a D&D 3.75 in a way. But we used those actual game mechanics when we played Metamorphosis Alpha, and converting between the two. If you're familiar with the two systems, it's insanely easy to make the changes. But I would recommend doing that. I feel like the you play Metamorphosis Alpha for the story, not for the game mechanics. Um, and when I'm talking about the game and I'm talking about, and I know I feel it seems like I've been all over the place with this. I talk about the Dead Mall series and stuff like that. Um, if that's not how you feel, if you're someone who just loves the world today, um, I'm guessing you wouldn't like this game. But if you're a person who's like myself, and if you're not, that's fine, by the way, to each his own. But if you're like me, where you are nostalgic for a bygone era, I feel like this game might scratch that itch for you. But yeah, I would run it in some newer rules. I haven't done it in fifth edition. The last time I ran it was before fifth edition came out. Um, but I would assume it would be pretty easy. I can't imagine it being that difficult to pull off. Is there anything else I should say about it? I feel like I've actually done a pretty good job of conveying what Metamorphosis Alpha is and why I like it so much. Um, I guess I'll go then back to my own game. So in our game, our D&D campaign that we've been playing, we just finished the expedition to the Barrier Peaks. Our D&D characters, which one of them, Arthur, is from Earth. So he has a sort of more of a stake in things as far as the um going to the warden, right? But the idea is that they completed the dungeon, they got all of the repair robots up and running again. They brought a couple guys with them to make repairs also, like they had a tinker gnome named Gamish. At any rate, so the short version is they completed the dungeon, they fixed the ship. The ship is back up in space again now. The autopilot has come on, which like I met Gary Gygax back in the summer of 2001. We spoke about some of this stuff. So the idea is the autopilot is taking the D&D characters to the warden, um, where where they can then go around the ship and get rid of these mutants and zombies and the various things on the ship that are problems. So you would probably expect me then logically to run a series of adventures that take place on the Warden. Um, and we do that. And I tell you, oh, they go into the farm area and there's, whatever, there's a Minotaur like in the field where the cows should be, and they got to fight him and blah blah blah. I'm actually not going to do it this time because my players have done that so many times, and they're just not really wanting to do that again. They like the Warden, they like Metamorphosis Alpha, but it's kind of like an old video game that you've already beat the game half a dozen times. Maybe you just don't feel like playing it right now, you know. So it's kind of like that. Um, so because my players have already quote unquote beat the game, so many times in the past, I'm not going to make them do it again. I'm not going to give them any experience points for that part of the story, but I am going to say that they go to the Warden and just, the next time we see the Warden, it will be after that has happened and um they won. I'll say this too. In Dungeons and Dragons, you've got magic, of course, spells. In my humble opinion, as far as the rules go, I think the ability to cast a spell is a sort of a wild card kind of a thing. It can be, especially if you're a high level spellcaster, that's a big game changer, man. Um, in Metamorphosis Alpha, there is no magic. So like really everything you fight is pretty much some kind of a mutant life form. And so in my opinion, D&D characters are going to beat Metamorphosis Alpha characters every time. And the fact that because some of the stuff we did, we played the one thing that was the supposedly the unwinnable dungeon, and we had a bunch of party kills, and I let the one guy play a beholder. So we actually have a beholder in the party right now. And even then, the beholder has almost died half a dozen times. So that's a pretty good indicator of um how dangerous the campaign is, right? Uh at any rate, so we got this beholder in the party, which normally I would never do. But when he goes to the Metamorphosis Alpha, he's just gonna clean house. Like literally, the death ray is gonna start killing all the fungus and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, there's nothing on the ship that could deal with a beholder. Nothing at all, you know. So that also makes it kind of pointless to play it out. But yeah, the next time we play, the ship is just going to arrive at its destination. The people who have the ability to repair the ship, like we got, like I said, a Tinker Gnome. There's multiple androids from the Barrier Peaks adventure. All of these characters are going to be making repairs to the ship while the ship is in orbit of the next planet. And we're going to keep doing the Rod of Seven Parts stuff. Um, so that should be fun. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If so, I'd love it if you hit like, ring the bell for notifications so you know when I make more videos. Be sure that you're subscribed to the channel. Um, and if you've ever played Metamorphosis Alpha, put it in the comments section. I would love to hear um, how you liked the game. Also, which edition did you play? Because today I've pretty much exclusively only spoken about first edition. Um, I'd be curious about that. Um, but yeah, that's it for me today. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope everybody stays safe. Where I am, the weather is horrible. So wherever you are, stay safe, stay indoors, stay comfortable, play some games, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.